So, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from today, and welcome to our very last webinar series of 2024, brought to you by CPS HR Consulting, your partner for HR in the public sector. In today's webinar, we'll be taking a deep dive into From Job Analysis to Job Description, presented by CPS HR Senior Consultant Jeff Burkaw. Before we kickstart the session, I have some quick housekeeping notes as usual. This webinar is being recorded and will be accessible for replay later in the day. We will post a recording on the CPS HR webinar webpage for your convenience, and we will also send all attendees an email with the link to the recording. So be on the lookout for that tomorrow. All attendees will be in listen-only mode to ensure the best audio quality for everyone. Please feel free to use the chat feature to engage in conversation and share your thoughts with one another. If a question pops up during the webinar, don't shy away. Use the Q&A feature that you see at the bottom of your toolbar here to send it in, and we'll tackle as many as we can towards the end, time permitting. Now, without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to our expert consultant to enlighten us on job analysis and job description. Jeff, take it away.
Thanks, Marissa. Welcome, everybody. Hope you're all staying warm and dry and all of that. I noticed a lot of California people saying that it is cloudy and rainy, and I hear it's supposed to get really, really bad. So stay inside. And for the next 45, 50 minutes or whatever it is, I'm going to define what it is I'm talking about when I say from job analysis to job description. As Marissa said, my name is Jeff Burkaw, and I'm a senior consultant here at CPS HR. In my various roles at CPS, I perform a lot of job analysis, and as you probably know, you can use the results from job analysis for lots of different things. And so I will do job analysis for creating selection processes and recruitment programs. And one thing that I use it for is for updating job descriptions. So I'm gonna talk about that, about going from job analysis results to the language of a job description. But I want to talk a little bit about job descriptions themselves. We don't often think about our job descriptions and how important they really are. Um, when I'm doing job analysis, or I also teach the job analysis class for CPS HR's HR Academy, and a question I get all the time is, when do I need to do a job analysis? And and my answer is anytime that you need accurate, up-to-date information about the jobs in your organization, so what people do in your organization, and what it takes to be successful in those particular jobs. And then I say, when would you not need that information? And really, you need to have that information all the time for anything that you do. I would argue for anything that you do in human resources, you always have to have accurate, up-to-date information about the jobs in your organization and what it takes for people to be successful so that you can get the right people into the right jobs and make sure that people are performing up to expectations and train people and promote people and all of these different decisions based on that information. Well, that information is generally housed within a job description. I mean, if you think about it, you do have information about, your jobs in your organization, but is that in big files? Do you have like a big file on some job that describes all the different aspects of it? Well, probably not. You probably have a job description, and that's where all of that information resides. You might not have job descriptions. There are some public agencies that only use class specifications, but for our purposes, it's kind of the same thing. And class specifications aren't generally as detailed, so a job description is generally better. I'll talk about the different elements of a job description and why it is so descriptive. Um, but so given that job descriptions are so important, that brings up the question, how often do we actually go back to our job descriptions and revise them and make sure they're accurate and up to date? I get a lot of answers to that question from from no, not at all, to kind of, but there's some confusion about how to go about that. Um, Often agencies will tell me that they can't really revise their job descriptions because to do so practically takes an act of Congress. It's almost as if they're written in stone, and they can study a job all they want and come up with all of the tasks and the KSAs and everything required for the job and to develop selection processes and all of that. But as far as going to the job description and then making sure it's up to date, often they can't do that because you would have to go through a state personnel board or civil service commission or city council or something, and it's just really hard to do. Now, sometimes you are constrained like that, but if you have the opportunity at all to review and update your job descriptions, you really need to. I mean, you think about um, the what we use our job descriptions for. I mean, we will actually use the information in the job descriptions for performance management and for training analysis and for developing recruitment and hiring programs and all of that. So you really should do it. So assuming that you do, well, how do you go about it? Where do you get the information? And of course, you're figuring the next thing I'm going to say is from your job analysis, and you're exactly right. The only way to really get the information that you need to make sure your job analysis is complete and accurate, I'm sorry, your job description is complete and accurate, is from a job analysis process. Um, we don't have time here for me to go into what goes into a job analysis and the methodology and all of that, but generally speaking, a job analysis is a way of studying a job in a systematic manner to identify the work that's performed on the job. And we usually think of that in terms of tasks. We break down a job into a whole bunch of different tasks that are performed on the job. And then the qualities that are needed to perform that work successfully. We generally think of that in terms of KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. Could be some other things too, but at a minimum, knowledge, skills, and abilities. We define what is important for performing the job, when people need to have those knowledge, skills, and abilities, whether it's upon hire or if they're learned later on the job and that sort of thing. So, so as I was saying, in job analysis, we typically end up with a big list of task statements and some kind of indication of how frequently each task is performed, how important each task is, and then a list of knowledges, skills, and abilities, or our KSAs, and an indication of which of those are most important for performing the job, which ones are critical, which ones do you have to have, or you just wouldn't be able to perform the job at all, or which ones are only somewhat important. And then, of course, like I just said, which of those KSAs are needed upon hire. So we get all of that information from a job analysis. But there is some confusion and some difficulty, it seems, in taking those job analysis results and translating it to the rather unique language of a job description. Uh, as you know, job descriptions, they typically have certain elements. There are certain common elements that you may or may not have in your job descriptions, but they're kind of general, sort of standard things that we always have in them. Like, it starts out with some kind of description of a general description of the job, called a definition or purpose or summary, something like that. Some sort of distinguishing characteristics, explaining how this job is different from other jobs in a hierarchy, what the reporting structures are and that sort of thing. Amount of supervision that is received. Are you closely supervised or do you work under general supervision or general direction? Do you supervise others? That sort of thing. And then really, really important, and as a job analyst, I think this is the most important part of a job description, is those duties, the duties and functions, and especially the essential functions. And I'm going to talk about the difference there. And then you might have those other duties, those other things that are performed, and the so-called marginal marginal duties. And this isn't that statement that says, it lists a whole bunch of things and then at the bottom it says, and other duties as required. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about specific things that we list that aren't essential, but you might have to do them at some point on the job. And then, of course, the qualifications for the job. There's minimum qualifications, and those could be in terms of actually spelling out the KSAs that are required at a minimum, but also things like education, training, experience, things that would indicate that someone has those KSAs at a minimally acceptable level. But then we also might have desirable qualifications or preferred qualifications. So they're not minimal, but they're also helpful. They're good things. But so I'm going to really focus on these things, these duties, functions, the qualifications, and try to answer these questions. What makes a function essential? And then what makes a duty marginal? And now throughout this, I'm going to use function and duty kind of synonymously. Functions, duties, work behaviors, they're kind of the same thing. I'll explain what all that means. So usually when we talk about essential, essential, we talk about essential functions, or if it's other duties that are performed, it's often called marginal duties. So that's why I make that distinction. But so what makes something essential versus marginal? Is it, how do we actually figure out which of those things aren't really fundamental to the job, but they're also kind of performed? There's some ambiguity there. And then with the qualifications, what makes something a minimum qualification versus something that's just desirable or preferred? Well, we can, not surprisingly, you probably figured out this is where I'm going. We can use our job analysis results to help define that. We've got our tasks. Remember, we've got a big long list of tasks that we've identified in our job analysis with an indication of which ones are most important, which ones are most frequently performed. We can use that information to identify what's essential and then what duties would be marginal. And I'll show you how to do that. And then we've got our KSAs. We have a big long list of KSAs with an indication of which ones are most important and which ones are needed upon hire. We can use that to determine what's a minimum qualification versus what's a desirable qualification. And so by doing this, it's really, really important that we don't develop or revise a job description based on assumptions about the job. We don't want to assume what people do or assume that people have to have a certain degree or certain kind of experience. And then desirable qualifications aren't just things that are nice to have. They're very specific KSAs that we've identified as those desirable or preferred. So I'm gonna take a look at these basic elements of the job description. As I said, I'm going to focus on those duties and the qualifications and all of that. But let's start breaking this down a little bit. So I'm going to talk fairly briefly about the first kind of set, the first five or so. Um, as you know, there's always some kind of a summary or a definition, or sometimes it's called purpose of the job. And that's that paragraph that explains overall, in very broad terms, what the job is. And reading this, you get an idea really of kind of everything that is done in this job, the overall responsibilities. Some people think of that summary as describing the job in 30 words or less. Like if this were your job and this is your elevator speech, so what do you do? And you have to define the job. That's what it is basically. So it's kind of overall responsibilities. Now, um, I want to point out something about the word responsibilities because this is something that I see a lot. You probably see this in job descriptions where it'll say duties and responsibilities. But responsibilities are not duties. They're not functions, they're not duties, and they're not tasks. When we break down a job and we look at the work that's performed on the job, we can divide up the work, or at least the ways of explaining the work, in a hierarchy where responsibilities are the very highest level. And this is a way of describing a job in the broadest terms. So something like managing the human resources department or managing human resources programs. It's very, very broad, ultimate responsibility. Within a responsibility, we have those functions or duties. You can take pretty much any job and you can look at all of the different tasks that are performed, and you can group those into areas of, kind of different areas of the job that really collectively define the job. And you can usually describe those in maybe, four, five, or six, essential functions. But each one of those is going to be related to the responsibilities. But then within each one of those functions or duties, we have the job tasks. So the job tasks are individual components that are performed in completing a particular duty. So this is the hierarchy of work that um, that definition or purpose really is the responsibilities, and it's just the very, very broadest definition. But then my point here is to watch out with those terms. What we're going to have listed on, in the definition of purpose really is going to be the responsibilities. But then when we get down to the functions or duties, um, it's going to be a matter of taking our job tasks and rolling those up into the job duties. I'll show you that in a second. But so the general definition is is broad. This is not where we're not listing individual job tasks or even necessarily duties, but you want it very, very broad. Here's an example of, from that job description, an example of a police sergeant job description where this definition kind of describes the job very well in looks like 30 words or less or so, but you can see it's very, very broad. Under direction, coordinates and supervises the activities and operations of a team of police employees, etc. Very broad. You can imagine that within this, there are several very important duties or functions. And then within each one of those duties and functions, there would be a whole bunch of different tasks. Now, all of that information, of course, is going to come from your job analysis, but it's just kind of a basic description. And some of this other stuff is fairly straightforward, and you'll get it through your job descript your job analysis, or it's just sort of common knowledge, like the distinguishing characteristics. This is where you're going to have whatever distinguishes this job from other jobs, in a hierarchy. Like, is it entry level? Is it journey level? The first level supervisor? And then we've got this, some kind of indication of supervision received and exercised. So you might use terms like works under close supervision, general supervision, direction, general direction. So this is, progressing from most closely supervised to least supervised. Close supervision is where pretty much all the work is reviewed. There's, constant contact with the supervisor. You're probably given instructions for most tasks. And then as you go up to works under general direction, that's where you might check in with your supervisor or manager once in a while, but you're pretty much left, to figure things out on your own. So you'll probably have some kind of definitions like this. And these are fairly, common definitions. Um, so nothing too technical about that. But when we start getting into working conditions and physical demands, this is where you're really gonna need some job analysis information. So working conditions, if you've got that in your job descriptions, this is a description of the physical environment. So do people work in a, typical office environment? Do they work outdoors in all weather conditions? That sort of thing. And also any other conditions that could affect an individual's ability to perform the job one way or another, whether it's literally like a hazard and could be, dangerous, or it's just they need to be willing to work in that kind of environment, like exposure to noise, exposure to chemicals and dust. If there are hazards like risk of electric shock, that all that kind of stuff, you definitely want to have that in your job description somewhere because people need to be aware of that. But it's really important that you get this this information from your job analysis and a specific part of job analysis, which is job observation, where you literally go out and observe people performing the job, because that's really the only place you're going to see that and gather that information. Um, a lot of times in job analysis, I will interview people on the phone or virtually, and they say something like, "Yeah, we have to work outside or whatever," but they don't really have the details. And I get out there and I observe them, and I find that they're exposed to noise and dust and chemicals and all of this. So you want to make sure that that information comes from your job analysis process of some sort where you're observing the employees. And make sure, and this is really important, if this goes into your job description, make sure that if you're listing that as a working condition, that employees have to perform the essential functions under those conditions. Of course, I'll talk about essential functions in a second. But this is really important because you could be screening people out based on their inability to work under certain conditions. But if people don't have to perform essential functions under those conditions, that would be not fair and that would be improper and all of that. Similarly, uh, physical demands, you might list physical demands, like if you have to whatever physical activities you might have to do, standing, sitting, lifting, climbing, reaching with the arms, being able to see things at close range, visual acuity and differentiating colors and all kinds of things. You might have some kind of statement about those things. I just want to stress that you must gather that information through job observation, so it's absolutely objectively verified. And again, like the working conditions, if you're going to list those in your job description, you want to make sure um, that those things are absolutely necessary for performing the essential functions of the job. Otherwise, you could be screening people out if they couldn't handle certain physical certain physical demands. Well, if it's not needed for performing essential functions, that wouldn't be fair. And then, of course, by linking those physical demands to the essential functions, that's required for ADA purposes. I'm not going to be able to get into ADA in this in this webinar, but ADA does require that you identify the essential functions of a job, and then you should understand what the physical and sensory demands of those essential functions is, so that you could possibly you may have to be able to make accommodations. Okay, so that's the first the first five um, general elements of a job description. You may have something different. Yours may look slightly different, but these are kind of standard. But um, so just a reminder, especially when working conditions and physical demands and things really about the job and how it's performed, make sure you get that information from some kind of job analysis that includes observing the job. So now, this is what I wanted to spend most of the time on. I want to talk about functions and duties and what's essential and what's marginal, and then talk about the qualifications. Let's talk about functions and duties in general. Now, as I said before, I use the term functions and duties kind of synonymously, so think of it as sort of the same. Um, Functions and duties themselves are they're a segment of the work. And remember, I talked earlier about how you could take a job and sort of divide it up into its main components, just a few components. Um, and it's known as a function, a duty, a work behavior. An example would be supervise employees performing daily accounts payable and receivable duties. Maybe this would be a finance supervisor or something. So one of many things that they might do, or maybe a finance manager. Maybe one of the things that they do is supervising employees. So that's an important duty. And you can think of all of the different tasks that would go into performing that particular duty. I mean, think of that, everything that goes into supervising. We could come up with, 50 or maybe 100 different individual tasks, from um, coaching and guiding and mentoring and training and reviewing work, prioritizing and planning the work and creating schedules and facilitating staff meetings. And think of all the things that supervisors do that would go into that. So that would be one of our duties or functions. there's a rule of thumb is that you could you could define most jobs in 4 to 6 functions that are main parts of the job. That's not a hard and fast rule, but that's kind of a generally speaking, you can. Um, and you get this information from the most important tasks in our job analysis, which we'll talk about in a second. Just to clarify what a task is versus a duty. So a task is a component in the performance of a duty. So it's one of many things that you do when performing a particular duty or function. And duties and functions generally consist of multiple different tasks. Well, if you look at our job description, we have our essential functions. Our functions are essential functions. They're not in task form, but they are, um, there's a lot to them. If you look at, say, these two, the first one accepts supervisory responsibility for activities, operations, and services in an assigned program area, etc. So you can think of lots of different tasks that would go into this particular duty. And the second one establishes or revises priorities, work methods, activities, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So these are functions or duties because each one of these represents a piece of that job. And for this person, this is for a police sergeant, a police, first level supervisor. This would represent two major parts of their job. And you can see the way that they've done this, they've taken the supervisory related tasks and they've grouped them into this one duty or function that represents all of the supervisory stuff. And then the second one, they've taken what I would call the management related tasks, and they've grouped those into this management essential function. So there's two major essential functions that define probably most of what a police sergeant does. There might be a couple other ones. There could be like community liaison or training and development or something like that. But my point here is that what you need to do is you need to develop your functions by taking those important task statements and rolling them up based on similarity. Well, let's talk about what makes a function essential versus marginal. So an essential function, it's fundamental to the job. Um, a lot of this definition comes from ADA and other places, kind of standard. It's you think about the work that's being performed, and it's work that is being performed um, or I should say, the job was created so that that work could get performed. For example, a receptionist job. We needed someone to sit at the front and to greet, clients or customers as they come in and provide information or whatever. So that duty, greet clients and customers and provide information, is fundamental to the job of a receptionist. That job was created in part to get that work done. So that's a great way to look at a duty and what is really fundamental. Another way to look at it is consequences of error. Consequences of error means if that particular duty were not performed, or if it weren't performed well, what kind of consequences would there be? Would you be failing at the job completely? Would it be a dangerous situation? Would you put other people, in at harm? Um, does it have consequences for other aspects of the job or to other jobs? Think about if you do a lot of project work, an important duty of yours is planning and organizing your work. Estimating timelines and prioritizing tasks and planning out your work. If you didn't do that or you weren't good at that, other parts of your job will suffer. You're not going to do very good, do very well in your projects. You're not going to get them done on time if you aren't good at that planning and organizing or whatever. Or there could be consequences to other jobs. If you don't get something done, is it going to affect someone else in another job? So just another way of looking at what makes something essential. Um, We can also look at how often the duties are performed or the tasks that make up that duty are performed. Um, we want to see tasks that are performed with some regularity. Maybe every day, maybe every few days or weekly, maybe monthly, but if they're considered important, but probably not things that are only done once a year or it's only come up once or twice the entire time I've been on the job, that sort of thing. Or also, a significant amount of time is spent performing those particular duties. There's a rule of thumb that's about 20% of the time. Really, if you think about dividing up a job into, that 4 to 6 most important components, those, essential functions, could you, divide up the time spent on all of those and, would it be roughly equal or would any of them fall below, say, like down to around 10% or lower, then it's probably not fundamental. But not surprisingly, we can get a lot of this information from our job analysis results. Here is a page of task results. And if you've done job analysis, you know that basically you've got a whole list of tasks that are performed on the job, and you have some kind of indication of how frequently they're performed and how important they are in terms of overall job performance. And we usually, we get that information from having subject matter experts do some kind of a rating process where they indicate, with a rating scale, how often they perform the task, how important the task is, and then we come up with an average based on all of the subject matter experts. So here you can see that in this example, we've got 7 different tasks, and we can see that some are performed daily, some are performed daily to weekly, some are performed weekly to monthly, one is every few months to yearly. So we've got a variety of frequency. And then we can see that some of the tasks are critical. So high consequences of error. Really, if you didn't do that task correctly, you're kind of failing at the job or there are consequences. Um, so some are critical, some are very important. One of them, at least one's important. A couple of them are just somewhat important. So we've got a lot of information to go on. So remember what we're looking for when we're talking about essential functions. We want to look for things that are generally performed frequently, at least with some regularity, and we also want things that are important. So a good place to start is you look at certainly your critical tasks or your very important tasks, and then also the tasks that are performed most often. You can see that with these 4, these are probably going to make up our essential functions. You can see the other ones. 2 of them, number 4 is just somewhat important, and number 7 is just somewhat important, and then number 6 is considered important, but only performed every few months to yearly, so not really that essential, maybe. So this is probably our good starting point for what are going to be our essential functions. Well, let's talk about the other ones now. So the so-called marginal functions or marginal duties. If you list these in your job description, you may not, but it's a good idea because these are things that are performed on the job. People should know that you may do these, once in a while. You have to be able to do this at some point on the job. So we do want to identify those. It's a good idea to put those in our job description. So these are not fundamental to the job. The job wasn't created to get that work done necessarily. It's just things that are done kind of peripherally um, in the performance of other things. They might be things that are performed very rarely. They could still be important, but performed very rarely. Um, they may be performed regularly, like every single day, but not all that important. Low consequences of error. Um, let's say if you have a job where, I don't know, you have to do a lot of printing and copying or whatever, and once in a while, the copier runs out of paper, and you have to go to the supply room and get a new case of paper and bring it to the copier. And you end up having to do that about once a week, maybe because no one else is doing it or whatever. So it is part of your job. You do it regularly. but it's really not fundamental to the job. It's not all that important. If you didn't do that correctly, it's not really going to have any consequences or whatever. But these things, it still could be important that you let people know they might have to be able to do that. And so these are also derived from the tasks identified in our job analysis. So generally, we're going to look at the tasks that are lower in the importance rating, and also tasks that are important, but not very frequently performed sort of once in a while. And these are just general rules. There are those situations where you have a task that is performed very rarely, but when it is performed, it's critical to the job. Maybe something is performed, once a year or less often. Think of a supervisor performing annual performance evaluations. That is annual. It's done literally once a year, but when it's done, it is critical. A supervisor has to be able to do that correctly. So that's something that wouldn't necessarily be marginal, even if it's not performed very often. But generally speaking, it's pretty easy to identify in our job analysis results which things are a little bit more marginal. If you look at number 4 here, performed, monthly to every few months, so not that regularly, and it's only considered somewhat important. Now, somewhat important is still not unimportant. It's still a little bit important, so that's pretty good for a marginal thing. Um, Number 6 is considered important, but it's only performed every few months to yearly. So not very often. Once it's kind of a once in a while thing. Number 7 is just somewhat important. So these are things that are not critical or very important. They're not performed daily or every couple of days, but they're still performed. So these are excellent tasks to use for creating our marginal duties. Now, these are just guidelines, and this is a good starting point, and I'll remind you of this later, but it's always good to use subject matter experts when you're doing this, when you're trying to identify what's fundamental, what's essential, and what's marginal. This is a great starting point. So I want to talk about minimum qualifications now. So minimum qualifications, traditionally, long time ago, um, job descriptions were just a description of the job and the work that's performed on the job and the work outputs and whatever. And then there would be a separate document essentially that would list all of the knowledges and skills, abilities people have to have, and whatever education, experience, and whatever people might have to have. And that was called job specifications. You might have heard that term, and that's not to be confused with class specifications or classification specifications. But they were called job specifications, and that was all the job requirements. Um, Now we generally combine all of that information into that one job description, which I think makes sense because you describe the job, and then right after that, you're describing what you need to do to be able to perform that job. But generally, the qualifications are it might be KSAs. You might actually list knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed at a minimum, and I'll talk about minimum in a second. You may also list those separately. Sometimes minimum qualifications are just education and experience, um, and also, of course, licenses and certifications. Now, that's licenses and certifications. That's easy. There's really not much judgment. It's usually required by law that someone has a certain license or certification. But we're really focused on identifying the KSAs and then identifying different education and experience. And so when we're talking about minimum, what we mean is minimum because it represents the qualities of a minimally acceptable applicant or candidate. This is, as you know, I'm sure you're familiar with this. As you know, this is what people require, or what we require of people just for them to get in the door. Just, usually in an application screen, just to bring them into the process where they go from applicant to now candidate, and they're in our selection process. This is just the absolute minimum. Well, how do we identify that? Not surprisingly, we do that through our um, through our job analysis results. And here is an example of KSA results. If you're familiar with job analysis, this probably looks familiar. We've got some, just this is an example. We've got three knowledges, we've got three skills and a couple of abilities. And then in our job analysis process, we have had subject matter experts rate each one of these according to how important each one is for performing this particular job. There's usually a rating scale that goes from, not important, somewhat important, important, very important, and critical. And then we take kind of the average and we figure out what level they are. And then we usually ask, is is this particular KSA needed upon hire versus something that's going to be learned on the job over time? And then we figure out, if the majority of the subject matter experts think that it's needed upon hire, and it's kind of a yes or no question. So here we've got some KSAs, and we have an indication of which ones are critical, which ones are very important, um, and very importantly, which ones are needed upon hire. So when thinking about our minimum qualifications, we want to make sure that our minimum qualifications only include those things that are needed upon hire. Later on, we can screen for other things that, are desirable qualifications, which I'll talk about in a second. But for our minimum qualifications, it's anything that's needed upon hire. You got to have it day one on the job. Before onboarding and training and all that kind of stuff, you got to come in with that, or you're just not going to be successful. And we also want to look for things that are very important to critical. I mean, there's no real rules to this except for it should be things that are needed upon hire, needed upon entry, but then it can be helpful to identify which ones are most critical. We may want to list only those. So our minimum qualifications in terms of KSAs, we can see in this case they have to have knowledge of general accounting principles and procedures, knowledge of basic statistics, and then a couple of skills: skill to compile numerical data from various sources, and skill to review the data to assess quality and accuracy and completeness, etc. Those are excellent minimum qualifications. It's not everything that's needed for performing the job, but it's what is absolutely, either critical or very important and all needed upon hire. We want to make sure that people have these at a minimum. I want to just point out something that, and this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. We want to avoid using buzzwords or terms that are really ambiguous, and using our KSAs from the job analysis and making our minimum qualifications really based on those KSAs will help us avoid that. Things like must be a team player, must be a self-starter, language that is maybe acceptable for a job announcement or exam announcement, kind of, but not not good for a job description because they're really ambiguous. What does be a team player mean? I mean, does that mean just getting along with others? Some people are really good at impression management, reading social situations and impression management, and people will think, wow, that person is a real team player. They get along with everyone or whatever, but they don't actually get anything done necessarily. And then self-starter, I see that a lot. What does that mean, really? It's about taking initiative, but we don't want to define the type of person we're looking for. We don't want to say we want this kind of person in our organization. That kind of thinking has led to a lot of discrimination over the decades. So think about the attributes that any given person should have to be able to do this work. So not team player, but ability to work cooperatively with others in a team environment. Very, very clear now that people have to work together, at least in certain aspects of this job, and be cooperative and all that sort of thing. And then that self-starter, what does it really mean? Well, maybe it's must be able to take initiative in making decisions and solving problems. So now, completely unambiguous, very straightforward. And because, we're using these, abilities from our job analysis, we'll be able to show their absolute job relatedness. Okay, um, so that's for listing your KSAs. So we've got, minimum qualifications. in terms of KSAs, like at a minimum, we saw a couple of knowledges and a couple of skills that as a minimum we want people to have. We can also identify different education and experience, of course. Now, this is a whole developing minimum qualifications that are valid is a whole different thing. In fact, I did a webinar last year on that, and I've done whole classes on that. So it's a big, huge area. But basically, we don't want to make assumptions about what sorts of education and experience people should have. Like because it's an accounting position, someone should necessarily have a degree in accounting. Not necessarily. We want to look at our important knowledge, skills, and abilities and identify the types and amounts of education experience that would have enabled someone to gain those particular KSAs at a minimum level. Well, let's look again um, at our KSA results from a job analysis. And we can look at remember, we've got our critical and very important KSAs that are needed upon hire. And we might look at a couple of these that could lend themselves to education and experience, especially knowledge, basic knowledge like the first two, 1 and 2, knowledge of general accounting principles and procedures, knowledge of basic statistics. No, knowledge is, that's education is certainly a great way to assess, knowledge or to assume someone has certain knowledge. So those could be, they might have to have coursework, college coursework in accounting and math and statistics and that sort of thing. Skills, best assessed, you could either give someone a skills test or whatever, but if you're just looking at screening applicants and you want, just a basic minimum qualification, great way to get at that is experience. So if you look at 5 and 6, we've got a couple of skills that we are minimally required. We might require people to have had some kind of experience. Must have experience compiling numerical data from multiple sources and reviewing the data for accuracy. So here's a couple of education statements and a couple of experience statements that are identified through our job analysis because they are very important or critical, and remember, extremely important, needed upon hire, needed upon entry. Well, let's talk about um, also using the task results as a way of identifying important experience, because sometimes we get really focused on our KSAs, but we're not thinking so much about our task results. We can go back to our task results and remember those things that were critical and that went into our essential functions. We can think about some of these as maybe you know um, experience requirements. Um, you know, we could ask people, do you have experience, or describe your experience, researching and applying policies, state laws, and ordinances in order to make decisions or something like that. So just a reminder to also go back to your tasks in your job analysis and find the ones that are critical and frequently performed, and those can help you um, identify experience requirements. So the last thing I want to talk about is the preferred or desirable qualifications. And I think this is what trips people up the most is understanding what that actually means. And traditionally, there's been the mistake that people have made um, is that these preferred or desirable qualifications are those things that are nice to have, not really required, but we would like people to have that. We think that, if people have this particular knowledge or a skill doing something that maybe not be directly needed for the job, that they're probably going to be better. They're going to learn faster. They're going to be better doing our tasks on our job. But that's not proper. That's not good enough. We can do better than that. Um, so really, we want to look for those qualifications that are not needed upon hire necessarily, but we can show with our job analysis that they would lead to better job performance. So think about terms of our KSAs. education, experiences, licenses, and certifications even. Um, so looking at the KSAs, we might look at the KSAs that are not quite as important. They're still important for performing the job, but they're not very important and they're not those critical ones. Or we can look at the KSAs that are important, but not needed upon hire. That's a very important one. Um, it's really important, and this is really key. If you're using preferred or desirable qualifications for making any kind of employment decisions, whether it's for any kind of screening or for a secondary selection process, you have to be sure that they're absolutely job related. That means that they are needed for performing the job, and that if someone had that particular KSA, that knowledge, skill, or ability, they would perform the job better. It would lead to better job performance. So if you had two people who, based on minimum qualifications, they were equally qualified, but one of them also had experience doing something or other, or a certain knowledge or a certain skill doing something, they would be the better job performer. You want to make sure that that is absolutely the case. So looking back at our KSAs from our job analysis, we can think of the ones that were important, at least important. They might be very important, they might be critical, but they weren't needed upon hire. They're needed at some other point on the job, but they're probably typically developed on the job over time. Well, if they are needed for performing the job, and if having those KSAs would make someone a better performer on the job, that is a good preferred or desirable qualification. Um, so we might have, thinking back to our results, we've got some KSAs that were needed, that were, you know, should be minimally required, like knowledge of general accounting principles and procedures and knowledge of basic statistics. And we might have, you know, um, we might require someone to have experience doing, compiling numerical data. But, and then we might say something like ability to interpret laws, rules, and regulations to make decisions preferred. So it's not required, but we prefer that. And if we have someone who's got experience doing that or knowledge of that or ability to do that, they would be preferred. And that's the person who's going to be the better job performer. Um, so think about the types and amount of education and experience that would enable someone to have acquired that particular ability. Like I just said, we might say it's preferred to have ability to interpret certain interpret laws, rules, and regulations. So we might say experience, not just ability to do that preferred, but experience. If we have someone who's got experience doing this, that would certainly be that would be preferred for sure. So just some final thoughts because we're wrapping up and we're about out of time. Um, Again, I can't stress enough how important job descriptions and all of the information in them are for all areas of human resources. Really, I don't think there's anything you can do in human resources that doesn't require um, having this accurate, up-to-date information about the jobs in your organization and what it takes for people to be successful. And all of that documentation, all of that gets boiled down into this one document, this job description. So they're extremely important. And considering the decisions that we make based on what's in the job descriptions, about screening applicants and letting applicants know what's required of them in the job, and for performance management, making sure people can perform those essential functions every time they're reviewed and whatever. It's so important that they be kept current and up to date, or current, up to date, accurate, because jobs change over time. So a job description from 5 years ago could be very different or rather different than, how the job is right now. And to update them, you really should be using job analysis data like I'm talking about. You should have some kind of process for evaluating your jobs, for formal study of your jobs. And you should use that information for updating your job descriptions. So often I see there's a disconnect where even agencies and organizations that do great job analysis for selection purposes say they they don't use that information for updating their job descriptions. Even if they are updating their job descriptions, they don't actually compare the information from the job analysis to the job description. You should really be doing that. And also, um, I mentioned this earlier before, but you should also use subject matter experts when you're doing this. So identifying which tasks are going to make up your essential functions and identifying, which KSAs are going to be considered, minimum qualifications versus desired. What I'm showing you here, is a really great starting point, but then do use subject matter experts and get their opinion on all of that. And the most important aspect of this is using that job analytical data helps ensure that all of those decisions that we're making based on any of those components of the job description are valid. So think about, certainly our minimum qualifications, making sure that we are requiring only things that are absolutely required for performing the job. Education is based on just what exactly, what kind of education would have enabled someone to gain those knowledges, and the experience is based on what, would have enabled someone to gain skills doing certain things that are required for the job. And of course, working conditions, physical requirements, all of our preferred qualifications. Um, it's using our job analysis is going to ensure that all of that is valid and that our all of our decisions are ultimately valid. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I could talk about job analysis and job descriptions all day long, but that was just kind of an overview, and I hope it encourages you to, if you're not already, to do some kind of systematic review and revision of your job descriptions and using job analytic data, and just make sure that everything in your job description is absolutely accurate and up to date. And we are out of time, unfortunately, but I think there might be a little, if Marissa lets us, there might be a little bit of time for questions. Otherwise, you can also, my email is on this slide, so feel free to contact me by email with any questions, comments, concerns about job descriptions, job analysis, testing, anything at all. All right, Marissa,
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much for being here and for such an enlightening and informative presentation. There was definitely a lot of great information in there. So thank you for being here and for presenting today. So just
thank
a
you.
few things to note before we get into one or two questions. We just have a few minutes here. So as a reminder to our attendees, this webinar has been recorded and will be available for replay on the webinar homepage on our website at www.cpshr.us. Be sure to check it out and share with your colleagues. CPSHR's, sorry, CPS HR consulting suite of services and products range from organizational culture, recruitment, training, test rental, job analysis, and so much more. If you're looking to transform your organization, contact us today to see how we can tailor our services to meet your unique needs. Lastly, please take a moment to complete our short survey that will appear after the close of the webinar. Thank you in advance for your time and insights. And once again, thank you, Jeff. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Our next webinar is scheduled for January 22nd in 2025 on developing your succession planning program. We hope to see you there.